Imagine a world without art or culture. No paintings, no dance, no music, no sculpture, literature or poetry. It would be a very, very dull world, devoid of imagination. That's something that makes us different from other species. Hello everyone and welcome to the Navin Times Talk from the Heart. Our guest today is a designer and art historian, Dr. Annapurna Garimella. Hello, Dr. Garimella, and welcome to our show.
Thank you. Please just call me Annapurna. I'm most comfortable with that.
All right, fine. For our audiences, art is very vast. So to help not just me, but even you and everyone who's watching and listening to us, to make it easier to understand, we have divided this talk into two parts: making and learning art, and of course looking at art, whereby we will be speaking about art histories, art making, and of course audiences. Dr. Annapurna, are we ready to start?
Yes, we are. We're ready to start.
All right.
I'm ready to start.
Okay.
First of all, let me just begin by saying thank you for inviting me. And I'm thrilled to be talking to audiences in Goa and to a Goan television channel. And I know that your reach is worldwide, but it begins in Goa, and that's thrilling. I have a lot of love and attachment to Goa.
I can imagine, because most people, when they come to Goa, they are like, they only consider Goa as most, of course, consider Goa as a party zone, but we've got so much of art and culture, Dr. Garimella, and I'm sure you've been to Goa and you must have seen that. Okay, to start, why would you say, Dr. Garimella, that the 19th century is a good time to start speaking and thinking about modern art making?
Okay, so when we first started this conversation between the two of us of doing this interview, you were very generous and you gave me the space to frame the conversation about art and audiences in any way that made sense. So I could have actually gone back to the pre-19th century era, to go to early Indian art, early South Asian art. I could have talked about art from all over the world, and that would have been fine. But I decided to focus the conversation from 1800 onwards, because I think this is the era in which many of our current ideas about art were consolidated and also began. So maybe the Renaissance was one moment when there was a separation between, let's say, the singular authorial artist and the guild and the artist or the studio artist, atelier artist. So, and then also in the 1800s, you had lots of new institutions beginning to develop. In the context of colonialism, in the context of imperialism, in the context of new materials. For example, synthetic color was invented in the 19th century, a byproduct of malaria research. And within, that was around 1856, and within 20, 30 years, there was a palette of colors, ready-made colors, that were just available to artists who wanted to paint. So they no longer had to spend time in the studio grinding their colors. So when we think about artists going out into the plein air, that's a French word, and the movement of painting in France and of course many other places, when we think about artists sitting outside and painting landscapes, one of the reasons why that's possible is because of the 19th century development of commercial paints, the arrival of commercial synthetic paints, which gave a huge palette and allowed artists to experiment on the canvas in a way they couldn't have done earlier. And then the 19th century is also the moment when many art schools began, and questions of why is art different, that art has to be made different from craft. This is not my opinion, and I don't hold on to that fully any longer, or in any way. I believe very strongly in what the art historian Glenn Adamson says, and this is my opinion also from growing up in India, that anything made with the hand can be both craft as well as art. It's not an either or. So you can have an ironsmith make a beautiful chopper. If you go to the Goa Chitra Museum, they're beautiful implements there. I just love that museum. And an ironsmith can make a very sharp knife and make it super functional, and everybody be really happy. And that's what ironsmiths most often do. But there will be the ironsmith who decides, I'm going to make this fabulous chopper, vegetable chopper, that looks like a really great bird or a lizard or something. Now that's a choice to express something in the material, in the function. And today I posted on our Instagram account a chopper from the Raja Dinkar Kelkar Museum in Pune about a chopper that goes down. It's the wing of this very predatory looking bird, and when the wing goes down, chuck goes the vegetable. And wow. The ironsmith is really thinking about, what is my material, what can I do, and what can I evoke in the person who's using this object. Also warning them, like, don't think I'm just in a kitchen tool, I'm also sharp and I can get you. So these kinds of playful things that I see today are an attempt to bridge this divide that developed in the starting in the 18th century, but really consolidated in the 19th century, that there are artists who make art and there are craftspeople who make objects. Craft, yeah. And also this enforced idea that craft is only handmade, whereas we know that and Goa is full of people like this, people who make things with machines, like welders and toolers, are deeply oriented to craft and are great. And if they make a good tool, they're craftspeople. So just because they make industrial products it doesn't make them not craftsmen or women, right? So, or craftspeople. So the questions that you began raising about why you wanted to have this conversation, actually they're questions that came to us in the 19th century. Like, how am I supposed to look at all this new art that paints, let's say in France, barmaids, Edouard Manet, dancers, Edgar Degas, mothers and daughters in a new way, like Berthe Morisot, and in India, people painting scenes of the countryside in a way that was never imaginable, that was neither fully naturalist or realist, nor was it a kind of idealized landscapes of court painting and picturized religious painting. So all these new things were happening in the 19th century, and we're still living in that, as they say in Hindi, under that canopy of those thoughts. We're still moving in that, but of course we're moving away from it also. So I'm hoping our conversation can bring us to that too. So art schools, the idea of the artist, the idea of an artist who's different from a craftsperson, the idea of an artist who signs their paintings and sells them in galleries. Galleries were a new thing. Going to see art in a museum became much more common in the 19th century. Artists started living in cities which were full of roads, like this is also in Goa, where the street level facade is a shop, and then above are apartments, like in Panjim, there's plenty of examples of this. So, you have wide availability of glass on street for street facade. So shop windows were a new phenomenon. And so when people would walk on the road, they would see themselves reflected in the glass,
Right.
and they would see the product behind the glass. So it's this new kind of consumerism, this new sense of a self that looks at something, that can approach something but not approach it. A new sense of a person that knows that they can watch themselves even as they might be watched by
Okay.
an object, enticed by an object, or by people behind that object, like shopkeepers and whatnot. So all these things enter into painting, into the idea of looking. So I'm hoping that our conversation will go in such a direction that we can explore when we talk about audiences and how to look at art, that looking at art is as complex an experience as making it art. So there's nothing simple about it.
It isn't.
It
It
isn't
isn't.
simple. It begins sometimes either simply or either with complexity. So it's often when we begin something with the idea that it's simple, we take things for granted. And then when somebody points out, oh, there's like I talked about the chopper in the Dinkar Kelkar Museum, the vegetable chopper, suddenly you begin to think about it in a more complex and interesting way. So for me, the 19th century is a very important moment. Yeah, please.
So, Doctor, as you said, you're so right in saying that it starts off easily, but art is so vast, it is so deep, it is really at times very unfathomable. So, for a layperson, for us, and I'm sure many of our viewers, we look at art and we say, oh, that's lovely, but we don't know how to define it, describe it. We just know it looks nice. From everything that you have just said, there was one thing that I wanted to ask you about. You said earlier paints were made by hand, and then later in the 19th century they were ready-made paints available. Is this attributed to the Industrial Revolution? Is that what you're saying, that revolution changed the face of art?
Yes, I think that many, many things began to be made in a different way. So you, instead of sitting in your studio and grinding a mineral pigment and getting it to the right consistency by adding this linseed oil and different kinds of unguents and whatnot and shellacking and all these sort of things, that handmade quality of paint was hop, skip, jumped over by the creation of synthetic paints that
Right.
came in pots, or it came in tubes, and they were in a box set. So you would get, instead of, let's say, 4 colors or 5 colors, which you then had to mix and then blend in the studio, you could go buy this ready-made set of maybe 12 colors, and then you could mingle it then and there. So in a way, it freed the artist from certain kinds of decision making to make other kinds of decisions, right? So also new kinds of tools developed, portable easels. The idea that there were public spaces that you could sit and paint. So, for example, in a public park. Public parks were new kinds of things that became really common in the 19th century. So for the 19th century brings together in a new way and creates a civic culture in which art making plays a big role. Art looking plays a big role, but both art making and art looking are part of wider social, political, environmental, industrial, economic transformations, gendered transformations, all of these things. Women started going to art schools. Women started going to art schools, though they were not allowed to study nudes and draw from the nude. So these were, but some women got around it by approaching things in a different way. Yeah, so all these questions, these things are nice. It's like a 19th century is
Right.
a very fertile moment for transformation.
Right. You also said that this was a time when the artist was able to see himself and
Or herself.
imagine, or herself. But you know, you were just saying that women were not allowed a lot of freedoms which the male, her male counterpart was allowed. So if an artist, him, her, who was looking at himself, you said this was a time he could or she could depict himself, herself. So is it a time for self-expression? Did self-expression come to its height, at this time?
Well, the idea that art should be about self-expression itself is probably really becomes very big in the 19th century.
Okay.
Of course, artists have often made self-portraits.
Right.
And much earlier, and here I'm talking about in Europe and in England. But in the 19th century, the idea of using yourself as the subject of your art becomes important, but also that your art represents some deep inner understanding of beauty or life or something, And that's a very romantic idea, and a romantic idea, romanticism itself is a 19th century a movement. And it's not just there in art, but it's there in music. So when you hear like Beethoven go, ba 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 ba, and those kinds of really very, very like strong, masculine, profound, big notes. Or when you read literature, which is evoking this very beautiful countryside, and elements of romanticism are there in for example, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, but also or Pasternak, when they talk about the Russian Revolution and the beauty and sadness of the countryside, or even in someone like, I would argue, Rabindranath Tagore, when he talks about the possibilities of human life in the countryside of then undivided Bengal. So romanticism is also very important part of this idea of self-expression, artistic self-expression.
Right. You said that women were not given the kind of liberties that the male were given. When did this change, especially in India? Let's talk about India. When were women allowed that kind of freedom, that they could paint what they wanted, nudes, everything included?
So the interesting thing is that women entering art schools was much later in the 20th century. In the 19th century, art schools were primarily oriented towards craftspeople in the beginning, trying to retrain hereditary craftsmen in ways that they could serve modern industry.
Okay.
That was one reason. Art schools were set up also to revive what some Indian and British intellectuals and government officials thought that because of the Industrial Revolution and because of colonialism, that traditional Indian art, whatever that traditional word means, historic Indian art skills had become really poor. So craftspeople had to be retrained. But the interesting thing by and large is that our craftspeople came, but they also resisted this kind of, what would we say, like colonization of their mind and their skill. So the people that joined many art schools were often upper caste people who wanted to think of themselves as artists in new ways. So this is what happened in Bengal, and to some extent in other parts of India. And women students did join in art schools, but more in the 20th century. The same goes for architecture schools, actually. Yeah. And when they join, they are oddly um, discriminated against? Are they really capable? Some women became artists because their family members supported them. So, for example, their husbands or their fathers would teach them. Or in the case of Shantiniketan, women were included right from the beginning as students. But Shantiniketan did not have nude drawing for men or women. So this is very important to acknowledge this whole question. There was also a recognition that women who, like say for example, in Bengal and in other parts of India, that women making things in domestic spaces were important, artistically important even for men. And I could go into it a lot more about that men were intellectuals and artists were thinking about the world that the West, the European world that existed in the outside of the home, and they're also looking at the way that women functioned within the home, and both were important for them to in their own transformation. For women, it wasn't that women were just in the home. So women's artistry, of course, manifested in other ways. For example, the way they transformed the way the sari was worn. Jnananandini Tagore changed the way the sari was worn to allow women to move outside of the home more freely, and to strike a pose, so to speak, that would put them on par with women in that were European and British, but also to able to move freely in public world. In India, everything happened in a different way.
Right.
Birth control, voting, education, anti-colonialism, modernization of a certain kind, if you want to use that word. All these things kind of come together similarly at the same time. And they are very different experiences for different classes of people and different castes of people and different genders of people.
All right. So you said that the women were encouraged and motivated to join these schools because of their husbands, fathers, their families, basically.
Not necessarily join the schools, but they were taught by husbands to handle oil paints, to work on canvas or paper or whatever. Or sometimes women just stole the knowledge because they saw what was happening around them. That's how women often themselves.
Yeah. We have a solution for everything. So, during this time, can you give us a few names of women who were very well known for their art? You know, when we were just learning and women were coming into this arena and expressing themselves, their art, through their art, who were some of them?
Well, many Tagore family women were important artists in their own rights, in their homes and whatnot. Okay. And I haven't worked much on that era, but people can read the book of Partha Mitter, and also there's another scholar, and I can send you some links of those names if you want to post them on your website or something. Right. But the quintessential artist that we consider, that in the sort of canonical Indian art history considers as the first truly great Indian modern artist, was a woman, and her name is Amrita Shergill. And Amrita Shergill was, of course, now canonized almost as the saint of Indian modern art and Indian modern feminism and whatnot, or feminist Indian, something like that. Not maybe she herself wouldn't use the word feminism, but she was certainly a very strong woman. So Amrita Shergill is very important. But there were a lot of women who were in the background. And again, I'll come up with the names for you. They've just flown out of my head.
That's fine.
But they were there. They were in the independence struggle in Andhra Pradesh and in other places. They were working and learning. Yeah.
Before you said Amrita Shergill, I had done, had read a little bit, and one of the names that did come up, like you rightly said, was Amrita Shergill. Now, I think many of our viewers, must have heard of Amrita Shergill. Can you tell us what was so unique about her work? What, stands out?
So all the things I've been saying about the 19th century, this idea of self-expression, self-observation, self-fashioning.
Right.
So this young woman who was in her teens and 20s, she
Wow.
was also mixed ethnicity. So she was Punjabi on one side and I think
Hungarian.
Hungarian
Yeah.
on the other side. And so she was very conscious of being of at least a dual background. And then she kept taking that dual background and using it to make it into herself into a multifaceted person, a woman, artist, someone who's very comfortable painting herself nude. She also painted her sister. She also was photographed intensely by her father. She was very into being the modern girl. That was a new kind of woman that was circulating all over the world. Lipstick and cigarettes and red lipstick and slicked back hair and all those kinds of things. And Goa also had modern girls.
Oh
I
yeah,
know
we
that.
did.
Lots of pictures.
Yes.
So she was really, and then she was also a person willing to confront this idea that I had been educated in Europe. I've come back to India and I'm going to explore what does it mean to practice in India. So she traveled all over India and she began to look at painting on paper, manuscript painting and other kinds of painting. She looked at Ajanta, she traveled south, she did this, she did that. She looked at bodies, like the bodies of Brahmins sitting together in a temple compound. And these became new subjects and new ways of looking at the world, looking at India, but also looking at herself. Who am I as an artist when I look at these people sitting in a temple courtyard who are so brown skinned and they have this jhanoti
Thread,
or jhaniwat
holy thread.
across the shoulder and they're bare chested and they have this great beauty, but they're also very stable. And then my self-portrait is full of energy and agitation, whereas I present them as more stable. So many things are going on. So she is that quintessence of somebody who is a product of the 19th century. She's also obviously benefiting from the work that suffragettes had done for advocating for women's rights in the late 19th and early part of the 20th century, to go to art schools, to have sexual freedoms, all these kinds of things. Yeah.
So, what was the main reason for these art schools to develop in India? And where were these?
So as I mentioned to you, it was in part both to improve, quote unquote, improve the level of, improve and regulate the way that craftspeople practiced their various crafts, pottery, metalsmithery, carpet making, weaving, whatever it was. They wanted to bring in you have to remember that the British made empire and England and Scotland and Wales were sustained in a large part by the income that Indian handicrafts produced.
Right.
And so this was very important first it was important to claim they were bad. So then you say that of course they need to be improved. And then you improve them And in the process of quote unquote improving them, you are attempt to change them so they fit into the
The mold.
industrial much better, right? They support the industrial system. And in a different way, there was this attempt to say, okay, craftspeople's craft has degenerated, and we must improve it by giving them proper art education. We must revive it. So if one was to modernize and one was to revive, but both were about imagining the craftsperson as somebody who didn't have a mind of their own, and that they needed to be molded and bent to the purpose at hand. So there was all these kinds of views were there, both these views were there. But of course, craftspeople often did their own thing. For example, they didn't go to classes. They took the scholarships and then they didn't go. Or so these things happen. Like people can circumvent the things which are forced upon them.
So, where were these schools, Doctor? Which part of India?
Lahore.
Okay.
Calcutta,
I beg your pardon?
Calcutta.
Okay, Calcutta. All right.
Madras, Bombay, in the princely states of India, including Hyderabad, Mysore, Jaipur, and the princely states set them up for other reasons. For example, in Mysore, the big art academy that still exists today, its origins are in the context of constructing the new Mysore city palace.
All right.
That was designed by a Britisher and made with elements from all over the world. It's very famous, like for cast iron pillars in its Kalyana Mandapa. But they needed artists who could translate and make paintings to be as murals and do inlay work. So an academy, a technical academy, was set up to produce the materials and in the process teach people how to produce the materials. Because when you scale things from, say, this size or this size to
Absolutely.
this size, it requires a lot of relearning your tool to change things. In many of the concerns in the princely states were about employment and employing their subjects, finding employment, to promote industry within the state, create products that would go to industrial exhibitions. So there were different motivations, but these are where the art schools began to develop. Yeah.
Right. Now, who was considered the ideal modern artist? We are talking about India, Dr. Garimella. So let's keep it to that. In India.
So by the 20th century, a lot of ideas had developed. Like in Kolkata, there was this idea that the ideal artist knew how to meld like manuscript painting that was from court painting with and historical subjects with this very fluid line that was inherited, that was taken from an interest in Pan-Asian art, Chinese and Japanese art, and created this beautiful lyricism, and also was nationalist. So an ideal artist was a nationalist. Ideal modern artist was a nationalist. Tagore, on the other hand, was not interested in nationalism, and he came to painting much later in life, and he was really interested in some kind of primitive, primordial forms, and the idea of experimentation, that expression itself is an opportunity to experiment with form. So all these sort of things. And he was interested in art that he had seen from indigenous people across the world. So he was that kind of person. If you saw in art schools like in Bombay, then a good student, a good artist was somebody who could perfectly replicate a plaster cast of a neoclassical, Greco-Roman neoclassical figure, replicate it, and then learn how that naturalistic process works. How do you make a naturalistic looking face? How do you make a naturalistic looking body, perfect size, proportions? And then transfer it to themes which are Indian, like a lady holding a lamp or a woman carrying water. So we still have those kinds of statues. They're there in fountains in Goa,
Yes.
in Bangalore, wherever. So there were those kinds of ideas. So an ideal modern artist after this period, like let's say when you think about someone like Amrita Shergill, she's arguing for, her work argues for a modernism or a modern artist who's oriented towards self-expression, breaking canons, um, being both international but also deeply committed to in South Asia and Indian subject matter, Indian light, Indian colors, all those kinds of things. By the time we move into, let's say, the Bombay progressives, and like people like Hussein and later Padamsee and Raza and all these different artists, you have this interest in working on the one hand with tradition. So a lot of artists, what they consider tradition, so they're really interested in classical Indian sculpture, going to Ajanta or to Ellora or to South Indian temples or to Khajuraho or wherever, and finding themes which make them make it easy for them to show subjects which are classical without necessarily being religious. So they paint loving couples in oil, and of course get into trouble for it. And that's what happened to Akbar Padamsee. Or in the case of Souza, when we're talking about an Goan artist, looking to Christ and his suffering as a way to talk about his own discomfort with his society and the world in which he lived in, and his own anger and his own sense of betrayal. So different things happen. And then when you look at, let's say, what was happening in the 80s in Baroda, there was this sense that the ideal artist is political. They use art languages which are of the people, even as they make their own art. So this is especially articulated by the noted curator and art historian Geeta Kapoor, and this exhibition at that time was called Place for People. Very important. And of course, many other things were happening all over the country. So, for example, if you look at Bengal or you look at Hyderabad, there's this idea that something that represents the landscape in which people live. So very often the countryside of the Deccan begins to appear in Hyderabad artists. They're not representing a Bengali or European landscape, they're representing a Deccani landscape in an idealized way, with lampanis and those kinds of things. So there's no fixed idea of who is an ideal modern artist. That itself keeps changing, and that's what's fascinating, and that's why it's tied to things like economics, politics, materials. There's a lot of anxiety, I think, for example, in Hyderabad about being forced to merge with Andhra Pradesh, and the complexity of losing its own identity or losing its specific regional identity. So these kinds of things were there, and artists who are from that region want to paint in ways that would be familiar to somebody living in Paris, but the subject and their feeling in it would be very much part of their own world.
So it's very distinguished from other parts of the world, is what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that you cannot there's an ideas of ideal artists, but you can't homogenize what those ideals were.
All right.
Ideals themselves were different in some ways in different places.
All right. Now, you spoke about Souza and you spoke about Akbar, I think you said, whose religious depictions have caused troubled history. Has that changed? Are we today more open to religious depictions do you feel that?
Gosh, it's a very okay. So now I have to just kind of pedal back a little bit into history, so I can say there's always worry about, can a religious image be made properly? That's why we have Shilpa Shastra texts that regulate how a image is made, what material it's made of, what the day it's made, how do you complete it, how do you give it life. But historically, the traditions of in India have also been suspicious of images. They're like, images are perhaps a less intellectually robust way of approaching divinity. If everything is divine, and you are divine, why do you need an image that separates it from you? So there's many things. And images made by one ruler were often the object of both desire. So other rulers might steal a particular god from a king's temple and take it back to their own to show, A, that they're better devotees, and B, that person is not a good devotee. That's why they were able to do this. Or B, destroy that shrine, and maybe even the image is part of war. And then, of course, there's also always been conflict in India, as much as there's been tolerance between various sects. Vaishnavites, the Vijayanagara king tells people in his kingdom that please don't destroy Jain temples. All darshanas, all ways of looking at the world are equal, and I'm going to institute a tax in which we will use that tax to repair all the Jain temples that are now either destroyed or decrepit. So when we see inscriptions like this, we know that there was no moment when, and we know, I'm not going to go into it because that's another discussion. So this is just to say that images are potent. Religious images particularly are potent. All images are potent, and religious images are particularly potent. But there's another thing I want to say. Any kind of art thinks itself as sacred. So one could argue that the museum is a temple in which we put art that is now considered sacred, and that's why we call it art, right?
Right.
So we have certain behaviors which are common. Common to temples and to religious places and to museums. So this is to complicate the question that you asked, not because it's a bad question, just because it requires the complication. And then to the questions of, I think there's a lot of pressure on people, artists today, to demonstrate their secularism, their religiosity, their opinions, their ideologies, and it takes a lot of preparation and a lot of skill to stage your opinion, your ideology in such a way that makes people think, but not think violently. Okay? So that's something people need to cultivate. Right?
So if I were to say in one sentence, now I'm sure you're going to correct me. Could I say art is complicated and sacred?
Well, it is sacred and it isn't sacred. So there are artists from very early in the 20th century. Someone like Marcel Duchamp would say, "Why is art sacred?" And then he bought a toilet and he signed it and he said, "This is art." And now it's a very valuable piece. The original is lost, but it's a valuable piece. Remakes have been done. So art is sacred for museums. For some people, art is like life, but more than life, because you talk about life in a specific way, in a specific context, with aesthetic ideas, with all these sort of things. And then some people would also say that art is not sacred. It's like any other human activity, but we make it sacred when we want to. Like, for example, to say that something that we like is really worth liking, or to say something that I'm selling is worth selling, and worth for you to buy. So all these kinds of things are there. I think that it's impossible to avoid controversy.
So to simplify it.
I just want to add one more thing. I don't think that it's necessary or good to avoid controversy. What I do think is important, because here in some way you're asking for my opinion, rather than just an art historian's art history. I think that to make statements through art, because it's a special part of life. Art is a special moment, a special thing in life. It's not the same thing as washing your hands in your sink, because we give it attention, time, money, economics, in a different way. It's very important to be very thoughtful, kind, and humble when doing something that can provoke controversy.
You're talking from the perspective of an artist, isn't it?
Yes, and now
Okay.
I will speak from the perspective of the audience. There's a role for the audience also.
Before we continue, Dr. Garimella, it's time for a very, very short break. To our audience, we are going to be back soon, so please don't go anywhere. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Navin Times Talk from the Heart. We are in conversation with designer and art historian Dr. Annapurna Garimella. Doctor, we were speaking about how do I look at art? What do I have to look for? Because, like I said at the beginning of the show, when I look at art, I say, oh, it's lovely colors, it looks nice, I understand it. If it's abstract, it's difficult. I'm talking about myself personally. I don't know what the painting or what the painter, the artist is trying to communicate. So for people like me and our viewers, how do I look at art? How do I interpret art?
So many things are familiar to us, so we don't even take them to be art. Actually, what we tend to take things as art is something that announces itself that it's art by having a frame around it, by looking a certain way, by being in a certain kind of place like a museum or the Serendipity Art Festival, or because somebody tells you, this is art, pay attention.
Right.
All these contexts. But the other thing is that much of art requires you to work to understand it. So in Hindustani music, there's this expression, ki kaan ko taiyar karna. That means that you cannot understand music just because you listen to music or you sing a song.
Excuse me.
Listen to music well and with some kind of commitment and developing knowledge requires you to tune your ear. It's not just the singer that needs to sing well, it's the listener's job to also tune their ear. So no one expects to understand physics and how rockets go into the sky without spending some time studying.
Right.
And I think it's important for people who are going to see art to spend some time studying. And many things in this world are not going to be easily understandable. So if it's important to a person to learn about art, how to look at things which they're unfamiliar with. They have to spend time going to museums first and foremost. They have to go to art galleries. They need to look at things online. They need to do a little bit of reading. They can have conversations. There's in Goa, there's so many galleries and talks at places like Sunaparanta and all over India. So participate, go. They're all free, they're all online, and begin to cultivate an understanding, just as like you cultivate an understanding of what is the kind of dress I want to wear, what are the kind of education I want to have, what is the kind of food I like to eat. One should also cultivate and think about very mindfully and consciously, how do I look at art? How do I have an opinion about art? How do I learn about art? What kind of art do I like? And get comfortable with not understanding. That's the first thing that we all have to do, is that get uncomfortable with not knowing and not understanding. That's the beginning of spending time. People can go and stand in front of a work, an abstract work of art, as you mentioned, and not understand it. And begin to think a little bit, is all art in my life figurative? So then you might think about like, not really. So if we think about, let's say, a large image of a star that stops looking like a star but looks just like radiant light. You see this in the church. Also an abstraction. You only understand it's a star because it's behind, or the sun or light or whatever, because it's behind the saint or Mary, or in the temple context we understand that a particular drawing which looks very abstract, a shape, is actually a mandala. So all these things can happen, and abstraction itself is an artistic challenge to the idea that just because you know something and you think it's familiar, there's nothing new to know about it.
So what you are saying is, to understand art, first and foremost, you have to understand that you don't need to understand. It's complicated, but
you have to understand that it's okay not to understand something at the beginning, and you have to put effort at understanding.
Right.
And then at the end of the effort, you might only get a little bit, but that's the case in many things in life, no?
Right. And finally, beauty, I mean, it's so cliche, but beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. Something that you like may not always, be liked by somebody else. So it's fine to like something that somebody else doesn't. Am I right?
Yes. Confidence. One should have that confidence.
Right. And Dr. Garimella, we have just time for one question, and that would be, we are a country where there's abundance of art and culture. But if I were to take time out for myself and give myself some time and say, I'm going to explore, I'm going to see the art and culture that is there in my country, where should I start?
Well, there are many places. If you want to pay money, you can go to, and it's for very little money. Our museums in our country charge very little money, and many of them are free, have free opportunities for free viewing, so one should go there. If you'd like to go to spend time outdoors, then you can go to archaeological sites, and you want to see beautiful things. You can go to churches, mosques, temples, if you're interested in that kind of an experience. If you want to go see things which are artistically made, but are also utilitarian, please go to your local bazaars, local market. Online is a wonderful option. So you can take up something you're interested in and start Googling it, and then it's like a rabbit hole. You go down and you keep learning new things. So learning about, and then there's festivals all over India. There are photography festivals, there are biennales. You can look at them, and go there and look and learn and talk to people. I especially like the context of going and talking to people who are sharing the experience of an event with you, because it's a great way to start a conversation, and everybody's interested in finding out more. Read, books to see art.
And
Read
of course,
something.
and of course, talk to people like you.
Well, I would be, that's why I'm here talking to you.
It has
Thank you
been
so
it
much.
has been a pleasure, and on behalf of the viewers and everyone at the Navin Times and the Goa 365 channel, we would like to say a very, very big thank you, because you have given
Thank you
us
so
a
much.
sneak peek into, art and how we should be looking at art. I think we are smarter, wiser in that area today. A wee bit, but we have made some progress. Thank you so
You're
much.
too kind.
Thank you
You
so
so much for your
much.
Bye
Right.
bye. Bye bye.
And to all our viewers, thank you for your time and for your patience. Until next time, take care.